Hello, and thank you for joining us. Thank you for attending this evening. We are very excited to celebrate Dr. Dorothy Roberts' Torn Apart. Just a little bit about our bookstore. So this is Source Booksellers here in Detroit, Michigan. We are a nonfiction niche bookstore. So both of these authors have books that we absolutely love hand selling. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about them and a little bit about their books. And so tonight we're celebrating Torn Apart with Dorothy Roberts, and she is the George A. Weiss University Professor of Law and Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania, where she directs the Penn program of Race, Science, and Society. I hope I got that right. She's the author of 4 books, but 3 that are very familiar to us in our bookstore. Shattered Bonds is one of her books. Fatal Invention is another book. And this one, Torn Apart, that we've been hand selling since its release, April 5th. She'll be joined by Jelani Cobb, who is a historian, a professor of journalism at Columbia University, and a staff writer at The New Yorker since 2015. He lives in New York, and possibly today he may be away from New York, but he is still here with us virtually. You may know one of the recent books that he edited, The Matter of Black Lives. This is a thick but important book. And so we have 2 authors that are going to have a fantastic conversation and help you to learn a little bit more about Torn Apart, and to let you know that we have the book available at Source Booksellers online and in store. So let's bring them up. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Hi, Dorothy.
Hi, Jelani.
It's good to see you.
It's good to see you too, and I'm so grateful that you are here to engage in conversation with me. I'm really looking forward to it, and I appreciate it so much.
Thank you. You know, I'm always, interested in your work, and I've been a big fan of your work for a long time. But it's also kind of paradoxical because it points out, so much of what is wrong that you walk away with this profound sense of, one, how could these things have happened, and how could I not have known more about them? And your most recent book, is no exception, to that. And so I guess if we start with just the 30,000-foot question that I like to start these dialogues with, how did you come to this topic? Because for all the institutions that we hear about, particularly as they relate to race and disparities and kind of disparate treatment, we really don't talk very much about the child welfare system. So how did this come across your radar?
Yeah, you're absolutely right that this is this gigantic $30 billion apparatus that intensively monitors Black communities, and yet it doesn't get in the news very much. And a lot of people, unless they're living in those communities, don't know about it. And I have to say, even though I have spent my entire career studying racial injustice, especially anti-Black racial injustice, I had gone into law teaching to do that. I wasn't even aware of the kind of intensity and harm of the system until the late 1980s. And so in the late 1980s, I was, or really in the early 1990s, I would say, I was working on my first book, Killing the Black Body. And that was sparked initially by my learning about the prosecutions of Black women for being pregnant and using drugs. And I was studying the criminalization of this public health problem and the very violent treatment that Black mothers were getting. And while I was working on the criminal legal systems, incursions into Black mothers' lives, and they're being incarcerated, prosecuted, incarcerated, I discovered that what was also happening to these same women was their newborn children were being taken from them. And I hadn't even thought about that, to be honest, when I started doing this research. And so once I learned that thousands and thousands of Black mothers were having their babies taken from them, even many of them held in hospitals that back then they were called border babies because they were boarding basically en masse in hospitals. I then said, let me look into this system that's doing this. This wasn't the criminal legal system. This was the civil so-called child protection system that was removing their children. I realized once I looked into it that there were massive numbers of Black children being taken from their families and placed in foster care, lots of investigations, and that in Black communities, it is extremely intensive, and everybody in those communities has been affected in some way by this intense investigation and family separation. And so that led me to want to investigate it some more. I was in Chicago teaching at Northwestern at the time. I started to observe court proceedings, and I never saw a white family in the courts. All I saw were Black families with judges separating them, putting their children in foster care, keeping them apart for months, years on end, Black mothers pleading to get their children back. And it was obvious to me from the very beginning that this was a system designed to disrupt Black families, and that it was an extremely segregated system. It seemed just curious to me and alarming to me that while there were other forms of segregation and violence against Black people that both researchers and activists were bringing to public attention and protesting against, there was very little of protest and research and discussion about this system that has so much power and has such an impact, especially on impoverished Black communities.
So if you talk about the child protective services or child welfare system, the idea that pops into the heads of most people is that this is a system that steps in when someone, a teacher, a community member, someone sees a child that has bruises or broken bones or some sort of signs of trauma, and that they are doing the work of protecting these children. The criticism we usually hear of child protective services is that they're too lenient, that there are circumstances where children die because they didn't step in aggressively enough. So is that a wrongful perception, or how is that at variance with what you learned in researching this book?
Yeah, that is a myth. That's a mythical narrative that has existed for a long time about the child welfare system, that it is a benevolent system that swoops in to rescue abused children and put them in better homes or get them adopted into better families. And there's a lot about that that's just false. So first of all, it isn't true that most children who are taken from their families are taken because of abuse, either physical or sexual abuse. The vast majority of children are removed for neglect. And the way in which most states define neglect is basically poverty. It's that children are in need, that parents haven't provided clothing, and some states list this, failure to provide clothing, housing, education, medical care, food. And all of that is that these parents are unable to provide adequate housing, adequate food, adequate education, adequate medical care. It's not that the parents don't want to, that they're deliberately depriving, they've got the resources, but they're deliberately depriving their children of this. It's simply that their family is impoverished and they don't have these material goods that children need. And only about 16% of children in foster care are there because of physical or sexual abuse. The rest are there because of neglect, which is almost always related to poverty. So the idea that this is a system that protects children from severe abuse, that's what it's designed to do. No, it's designed to deal with the problems that poor families have. And then on top of that, it's not only that Black children are much more likely to be impoverished than white children in America, but also it's because there are these stereotypes about the dysfunction of Black families that decision makers rely on in making decisions of who to report. And it's set up as this is the way to deal with the problem. So when you said teachers or a community member, somebody in the social services or a doctor reports, it's because that's what the system is set up to do in order to deal with needs of children they see. So instead of being able to provide what the children need, they're told, oh, you have to call the child abuse hotline. And then the system steps in and it doesn't provide these services. It tells parents they've got to provide it. And if they don't, the children will be removed from them or kept in foster care. So that's how the system operates, not the narrative, this narrative of kind, benevolent caseworkers who come in to rescue children from abuse. They're accusing parents, investigating them, removing children. And that's the impact that it has.
Mm-hmm. So, there's an interesting kind of lineage of this, a kind of narrative of this, when we think about just the way kind of social service agencies have interacted and interfaced with Black communities and Black families. There's a longstanding critique of that. One of the first things I thought of when I saw the book was the film Claudine, which
Right.
looks at that very same question in 1970, whatever year that was, that film
Right, yeah.
came out.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about the history of the system and how that plays into it?
Yes, well, to really understand the history and its relation to Black people, you'd have to go all the way back to slavery and the way in which white enslavers had total authority over Black children. In fact, they legally owned them as their chattel property, and Black parents had no authority to make decisions about their children. Also, their children could be separated from them and were at the whim of enslavers. On auction blocks, courts would order the purchase of family members apart from each other. So there is a long history in America of the separation of Black families. But then more recent than enslavement, and actually I think more related to the formal child welfare system, was the practice after the Civil War of taking Black children from their families on grounds of neglect and giving them as apprentices to work for former white enslavers, sometimes their own white enslavers, and thousands upon thousands of Black children were taken from their families and apprenticed out to white enslavers who forced them to work for them as a way. This is part of the white supremacist attempt to re-enslave Black people, to recapture Black labor after slavery ended. That included the convict leasing system and chain gangs, but it also included this capture of Black child labor enforced again by judges. So this was a form of a kind of child welfare system that could apply to white children as well, except that it was deliberately used and sometimes included in the Black codes to remove Black children from their homes. Now, getting to more recent times, like what was going on in Claudine, also Malcolm X talks about this, the welfare coming in and taking and separating his brothers and sisters from his mother, who was determined to have a mental disorder and put in a psychiatric hospital while the children were taken. And he says, Black children under a white judge's rule, this is nothing but modern slavery, legalized modern slavery, he calls it. So all of this connection between welfare and child protection is something that developed in response to the civil rights movement and Black rebellion in the 1950s and 60s, as Black people demanded to be included in government service programs that were developed during the New Deal for white people, and Black people began to receive welfare benefits. There was a backlash against that, and a rule that was passed that said if the family can't provide a suitable home for the child they cannot get welfare benefits, and they can't keep the child. The child has to be removed from them. Now, this rule applied to Black people. This was developed in order to deny both welfare benefits, but also to separate the families of Black children. And we can see then this dramatic change from the 60s to the 90s, where in the past, child protective services meant providing income and other kinds of resources to intact families when they were predominantly white families. As soon as Black families began to enter both the welfare roles and then the child welfare roles, foster care became the number one service, so-called service for Black families. And we see a simultaneous explosion of funding by the federal government for foster care instead of for providing for children in their families. So that now we have 10 times as much money spent on separating children as we do on providing services for children in their homes under the federal funding for child welfare.
So we're saying, if I understand you correctly, the roots of this lie in the disparate reaction to Black poverty and white poverty in the households.
Yes, so I don't want to deny that the entire system is a system to deal with the needs of impoverished families. I don't want to make it seem as if it's just dealing with Black poverty. It deals with white poverty the same way as well. Our society is structured not to end poverty, to have the highest rate of childhood poverty of any Western nation. We also have the highest rate of removing children of any Western nation. So that's how the whole system is designed. But it is even more aggressive against Black impoverished families. And the system is upheld by these very disparaging stereotypes about Black families, which is true about so many punitive systems in America. They have disproportionate numbers of Black people, and the system itself is maintained by these very vilifying stereotypes about innate Black criminality or innate Black neglect for children, these ideas that fuel these punitive systems. And we can see, whether we're talking about the welfare system, the child welfare system, or the prison system, they all became more punitive and became a way of dealing with human needs in our society on the backs of Black people. And they're entangled with each other. This is one of the main points I want to get across in Torn Apart, is that we shouldn't see the civil child welfare system and the criminal punishment system as two separate systems. They work together and they operate in very similar ways.
Yeah, I that was the next thing that I wanted to ask about. This just kind of leapt out at me, looking at the comparisons. But could you talk more about that, in more detail about the relationship and the similarities between the criminal justice system and the child welfare system?
Yeah. So there's the historical similarity, as I pointed out, at the same time that we have the roots of mass incarceration in the era following the Civil War as part of a white backlash. We also have the child apprenticeship system developing against Black families in particular as a result of a white backlash against Black emancipation. And then we can look to the 60s, where we see this massive explosion of incarceration, which parallels the massive explosion of foster care with larger and larger numbers of Black people involved. And then we can look into the 90s and the crime control bill that was passed in 1993, the abolition of a federal entitlement to welfare in 1996, and the adoption and Safe Families Act that sped up termination of parental rights in 1997. So, every era we want to look at where we can see the intensification of violence against Black communities, punitive systems to contain Black communities, and as a backlash against Black rebellion, the child welfare system is one of those. So that's a historical and political connection. But there's also the connection in terms of just the way they operate, just like criminal legal system accuses people of crimes, investigates them, arrests them, puts them in prison, puts them on parole. Same thing with the child welfare system. It accuses parents of mostly neglect. It investigates them. It prosecutes them. It takes their children away, and it gives them a kind of parole where you've got to meet these conditions to get your children back. It's just alarming how similar it is. And in fact, in some ways, the child welfare system has even greater powers, because caseworkers routinely go into Black communities and search the homes of parents who may only be accused based on an anonymous tip to a child maltreatment hotline. And they hardly ever apply the Fourth Amendment, for example, which we expect police officers to apply when they search homes. We expect them to get a warrant. No one expects very few people expect child welfare caseworkers to get a warrant before. No, they just knock on your door, and they may bring a police officer along and say, let us see inside your house, or we're going to take your children away. And most of the time, Black parents and family caregivers let them in. So they have massive powers. And when they start investigating, they investigate beyond what police investigate. They investigate every aspect of a family's private life. They go and they strip search children, police to look for evidence of abuse. It could be a tip that the child came to school with. I was on another program today where someone was saying the child came to school with a hole in the shoe and got called on. The family gets investigated. And then once they're there, caseworkers sometimes say, I have to see if this child is abused, and they strip search the child. They interrogate everybody. In some places, they've got these waivers that they have parents sign that give up right to privacy, basically, that allow the system to look into every aspect of their confidential lives, their health records, and other kinds of records. So massive surveillance. And to add to that, the digital surveillance, these child welfare agencies are following the model of police departments that are using big databases and computerized algorithms to spot areas of risk or families at risk. The same kinds of technologies that have built-in biases that make it more likely, just like with police, more likely they're going to go to Black neighborhoods. Same thing with the child welfare system. So they work in similar ways. And then finally, they work hand in hand. So caseworkers very often, especially when they go into Black communities, bring police with them. And there are joint task forces of police and caseworkers to answer accusations and investigate accusations of child maltreatment. So there's also this way in which they work together, and that expands the power of each one, because police officers don't bother to get a warrant if they're going with caseworkers to search a home. And by the same token, caseworkers are more able to get into homes if they have an armed police officer with them, because people are scared. And Black people are especially scared. I mean, I do write about a case in the book where a Black father was shot to death by a police officer on a simple child welfare investigation. And I start the book out with the story of a young woman with 2 small children at a family picnic.
Yeah, Vanessa Peterson.
Colorado, yeah. Vanessa Peoples.
Can you talk about what happened in that case?
Yes. So Vanessa Peoples, young woman in her 20s, nursing student. She was being tested for leukemia because she had health problems. She had asthma, rail thin, and she's trying to enjoy a nice day at the park with her family. And her cousin leaves the picnic, and her toddler follows along behind the cousin leaving. Now, Vanessa sees this happen. She grabs the other child and runs to get her toddler. But before she can get him, a passerby sees the toddler and leaving the park and calls the police. Now, Vanessa gets there before the police and says, "That's my son." And the woman refuses to turn the son over to her. She holds on to her little boy. Vanessa's not in shape to fight this woman over her son. She figures, I'll wait till the police officer comes and I'll take my child back. The police officer accuses her, Vanessa, of not being the mother of the child. And it takes her family to come and vouch for her. Now, you'd think, in a middle-class white neighborhood, a child, everybody's happy. Oh, thank you for catching my child, goes back to the picnic. No, she gets a ticket for child abuse and reckless endangerment of her son. So now she's been accused, basically, right, for child abuse, all based on a minute-long straying away of her little boy, which any parent knows this happens all the time.
All the time, right.
All the time. So a few weeks later, a caseworker shows up at her door with a trainee, these 2 women, one white, one Black. Vanessa's Black, by the way, shows up at the door and knocks on the door. Vanessa doesn't hear it because she's in the basement cleaning up, and she is hard of hearing in one ear. And her little boy comes to look out the window to see who's knocking at the door. And the caseworker says, oh, now the caseworker is alarmed because she's suspecting that the child is at home alone. She calls the police to come and back her up. And the police, 3 police officers arrive. They enter the home, one with a gun drawn, and Vanessa hears them in the basement comes up and says, why are you here? They say it's a child welfare investigation. She says, look at my children. They're fine. I'm here. Everything is fine. And they refuse to leave. They start interrogating her. They will not leave her home. And she calls her mother to come and assist her. And the mother comes and tries to take the children imagine the trauma for these little kids, right? To take the children to their bedroom. And a police officer refuses to let her be in the room, her mother, the grandmother of these children, without being supervised by a police officer. Vanessa starts to protest that they're not leaving. They won't let her mother take care of the children. And all of a sudden, one of the police officers, this is all on body cam, one of the police officers grabs her by the throat and throws her down to the ground. Now, by this point, more police officers have arrived for backup, and 3 of them do what's called hobbling her. They forcibly force her arms behind her back, out, dislocating her shoulder, and handcuff her shoulder. They chain her feet, and then a chain connects the two. If you can imagine, she describes
like slavery.
You've seen those scenes. Yes, it's exactly that scene of an enslaved person almost like on a stick, right? And they carry her out. Eventually, 7 police officers have arrived at her home. Now, mind you, this is all as a result of a little boy straying away for a minute with his mother watching him, going to get him. Vanessa, I'll just cut to the chase. She ends up having to plead guilty to avoid prison for child abuse. She spends a year under supervision, supervised visits. Fortunately, the children weren't taken from her. But believe me, in many cases, children are separated and put in foster care. And I'll just fast forward to today. I just talked to Vanessa a couple of weeks ago. She was a nursing student. She cannot get a job as a nurse because she's on a child abuse registry. She has tried to get an apartment. She's living with her mother, can't find housing because they look up her record and see she's on a child abuse registry. Her children have been traumatized. She's been traumatized. Nothing was done to these officers who brutalized her. And her life has been ruined. Their children are in worse shape because of this approach of accusing and investigating and violently interfering in families. And that's just, one of so many examples. And we don't hear about those. Now, the one we did hear about was when Saisha Mercado, an American Idol finalist, she was surrounded, her partner, and her 9-day-old baby or 10-day-old baby, newborn, were surrounded by sheriffs who seized her baby because her toddler had been taken from them on grounds that he wasn't thriving. When they brought him to the hospital for care and advice, they took custody of her toddler, and now her newborn baby gets thrown into this system as well. She was able to retrieve her baby after 9 days, but this newborn baby who had no harm done to her, who was breastfeeding from her mother, cared for by this loving couple, is terrorized by police. And what kind of trauma have her children suffered as well, just as a result of seeking help at a hospital to take better care of her child?
Yeah, I knew
this. Mm-hmm.
I knew about an instance, and this was right before the pandemic, where a woman was combing her son's hair and noticed that he had a knot on his head and didn't know where it came from, and just took him to the doctor to make sure that he was okay. And he never came home.
Yeah.
They lured her out of the room.
Yeah.
A social service person took the child, and then it took her months
Yeah.
to get access to her son. And what that does is discourage people from seeking medical care.
Yes.
Their logic, they literally said this to her, was that she said she didn't know how he got this injury, but
Yeah.
not even an injury, but like a bump on his head,
Right.
which children do all the time.
Yes.
And they said, well, if you don't know, you should have known. So you were either abusive or neglectful.
Yeah. Yeah, so that you're making a really good point, which is how the way the system operates actually deters people from getting help. So another story I tell in the book is about a woman named Angeline Montebon who called a domestic violence hotline for help because she was being abused by her partner. They had a 2-year-old son who had never been harmed. And instead of finding help for her, the domestic violence resource she called CPS on her. And the next day, in fact, that day, this was early in the morning when she called, that very day, caseworkers came to the house to investigate, and she ended up having her son taken from her and in foster care for 5 years before she was able to get him back. Now, there is clear evidence that the way the system operates, removing children from people who are survivors of domestic violence and seeking help, deters people from getting help that they need. And so I think many times when we do hear these tragic stories that are missed, by the way, by Child Protective Services, that's when you hear about them, as you said at the beginning. The response is, oh, we need more of it. Well, they're not doing their job. They're not protecting. And in fact, in many of these cases, there is violence in the home, but that this deters people from getting help for violence in the home. It doesn't help to have this accusatory type of system that blames the very survivors of violence for not preventing the violence against themselves, instead of creating ways to keep them and their children safe. So overall, even the way in which people become known to the system is generally through reporting. And mandated reporters are professionals who come into contact with children. And very often, they're the very people who could help families, like teachers and doctors and social service providers. But because the way in which they approach it, and they're taught to approach it, and they think they have a legal obligation to do this, when they see a family in need, instead of providing the resources for the family, which they may have at their disposal, they call the hotline, and children end up being removed or their families disrupted. And then the system doesn't provide what they need. A perfect example is housing. There are estimates that 1/3 of children in foster care today could be safely sent home if their parents had secure housing. The way in which the system responds to a family that's in a homeless shelter, for example, or in a dilapidated house or an apartment that has a cockroach infestation. It's not to get the landlord to clean the apartment or to provide affordable housing. It's to take the children out of the insecure housing. And then they don't
I want to jump in.
Yeah.
I want to jump in really quickly because we have some really good questions here.
Okay.
So there's one question, which is, are schools of social work under reform? Because it's really interesting that you have people who are being educated in social work who are still perpetuating this cycle.
Yeah. Well, so first let me say, one of the reasons people in social work perpetuate the cycle is because they're either working for this system and they're forced to do it. They don't have the resources. So they're told the only way you can help these families is either by taking their children away or by continue to invest, mandate that they improve Typical is family, parental training and therapies, which don't provide the concrete resources that families need. So that's what they have at their disposal. Secondly, usually caseworkers that go in to investigate are people with very little training. They may not have gone to a school of social work. They may be college grads, very young, who may have no experience dealing with families in Black neighborhoods and may have all sorts of stereotypes about these families. And they are thrown into this situation of investigating without the resources to do anything about it again, but take children or mandate that the parents go through all sorts of hoops in order to get their children back or to prevent their children being taken away. And then social workers who are mandated reporters are made to think that the way to help families is to report them instead of using the skills that they should have been taught about how to actually support families. So the way the system is set up structures social work in a way that's harmful, regardless of whether the social worker went into the profession to help families. This is not a system that's structured to let them do that. Now, is there reform? Yes, there is a growing movement, just like there's a growing movement in lots of different areas and cities to end this system. There's a growing movement within social work to reject this approach and to develop a radical approach to social work that truly cares for children and supports families and isn't based on accusation and investigation. For example, the University of Houston Graduate College of Social Work happens to be now led by a dean named Alan Detlef, who will say that he changed his whole philosophy when he read my book, Shattered Bonds. And he has now become the dean of a school of social work. And he says he's an abolitionist. In fact, he co-founded an organization called Upend, which is the Upend movement, which wants to upend this way of dealing with the needs of children and families. And by the way, he purchased copies of Torn Apart for every single student in the school. So and he wants them to learn about a different way of approaching child welfare that rejects this punitive system we have now. I've met so many social work students today who are working to end the system and figuring out this is what we need. Whenever we dismantle anything, we got to have something to replace it. We don't want to ignore the needs of families. It's that we want a better way of addressing the needs of families. And so many social workers and social work students, and students are really important here, are developing community-based ways of supporting children and families.
So there's a question here I think is really interesting, and I'll parse it down, for brevity's sake. But is this, how do we protect children who are at most serious risk?
Yeah.
At the risk end of the spectrum, while removing needless interference with so many families that are disproportionately Black and Indigenous, and also talking about the children at risk are disproportionately Black and Indigenous.
Yes, that's true too. So, well, one way is let me first say, I think that we have to have as our vision, the goal we're working toward, a completely different approach, which includes dismantling this system altogether. Now, we can't do that right away, and there is concern that as we make steps to reduce the numbers of children in foster care and provide alternative, different ways of addressing their needs, will we forget about the children who are being abused in their homes and where the home is dangerous. Again, that's not the vast majority at all. That's a fraction of the families that come in contact or need some kind of children that need some kind of assistance. And so we sometimes there isn't any other way of addressing it except the tools we have now. But I do believe, and I think this is well supported, that, for example, if we had a nation that truly ended childhood poverty, as I mentioned before, our nation has the highest rate of childhood poverty of any Western nation, and even higher rates than some nations that are considered developing, but the US falls short. Putting concrete resources, and that includes cash, supplemental income in the hands of parents would reduce the amount of even physical and sexual abuse in families. A lot of abuse happens because of stresses in families, like extreme stress in families. And so the ways that we would address neglect would also reduce, I'm not saying it's everything, but it would reduce that. What I mentioned about domestic violence, we know that the way we address intimate violence, family violence hasn't worked. And anti-carceral Black feminists, for example, have been working on transformative justice approaches, other approaches that would address and prevent violence better than what we're doing now. And also, as I pointed out before, the system, by relying on taking children away from survivors of domestic violence, make it less likely they're going to get help, seek help. And we don't even get, taking their children away doesn't give them the help they need. So there's so many things we could be doing today to reduce violence in families. And so I say, maybe now, the way things are set up, we don't have those tools yet developed enough to reach all the children who are being harmed in their homes. Again, I want to emphasize they're not the predominant numbers of children in foster care or under supervision by this very punitive system, but we will shrink the number of children who these people are concerned about might be left behind in an abolitionist vision. The abolitionist vision to dismantle a system isn't about doing it tomorrow. We can't, but we can work toward that. And I truly believe we could work toward society and communities where children are not killed in their homes, are not brutalized in their homes. That's the reasons for that have to do with the way in which violence is glorified in our society, the way in which we have deep inequities in our society, certain kinds of gender norms in our society, all that promote violence. The US is a violent nation, more violent than any other Western nation. And we need to grapple with that if we truly want to keep children safe.
Mm. So, we're running kind of low on time, but there is a question, which is, do you think law enforcement should be mandatory reporters?
I don't think anyone should be a mandatory reporter. I don't think, and I know that might seem strange, but mandating people to report their suspicions of children's needs. And again, most of these reports have to do with someone seeing a child in need. Professionals who are mandated reporters are hindered by this requirement. There's nothing about taking away mandated reporting that says they can't assist children. they can even report children without mandated reporting. What mandated reporting does is encourage who could be helping professionals like teachers and doctors and social service providers and daycare workers, all of them, to report suspicions of children's needs and hand over the help that they could give onto a punitive state system that is not going to help these children. And so if anything, it's, in my opinion, and many other people's opinions too, harmful. There was no mandated reporting until the 1960s. And then it was just for doctors to report sexual abuse. It has expanded since then. So that in some places, there's universal mandated reporting. That what families need are resources. They don't need to be reported on. And again, it doesn't restrict what professionals can do to help families. It frees them to do more to help families. So I don't think we should have mandated reporting. I do, and I don't think that police officers should be involved in child protection and child welfare. No, absolutely not. They use violent means to address what they perceive as a situation that's not safe, and it's harmful to put them in charge in any way of caring for families in need. And there is also evidence that police officers, the heavy involvement of police, law enforcement officers in Black neighborhoods is connected to why so many Black children get investigated for maltreatment and end up in foster care. I mean, that's part of the reason. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll have to wrap it up there. I will say quickly, I did a documentary on policing in Newark, and we have a scene in it where a police officer was serving a warrant or searching for someone who had a warrant and shows up at a residence, but the person's not there, but then marches around the house and criticizes the fact that there's laundry laying around, and then opens the refrigerator and says, "Why is there no juice in here for the kids?" Right. And I remember sitting going, like, juice is terrible for kids. What are you talking about?
Exactly. Right. They're not the experts on caring for children.
The way that everything can easily slide over into an allegation of child neglect is truly disturbing. And thank you for grappling with this problem in the course of this book and giving us more knowledge and resources to address this situation, which is disturbing at the least. And thank you for your whole body of work and for having done this for so many years.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate this conversation, and thanks to Source Booksellers also for hosting this. I truly appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much for this very interesting conversation. And I'm sure that all of the really, good and rich questions, there are more and more, the more that people really get into this book. When I was reading a bit, it made me think of Detroit. We're here in Detroit, and there's a water issue with water shutoffs. Mm-hmm. And the news reports always say, does losing your water mean losing your child? And I mean, it's a heartbreak. And every time I think of it, every time I think of someone fleeing our city in fear that their water is going to get turned off and their child will be removed.
Yes, that's a good example of how these inequities and injustices get put on the parents' shoulders, the family caregiver's shoulders, instead of where we should be focusing, which is how do we end these inequities and truly provide for families and children. Yeah. Yes. So thank you for that.
Well, just our call to action is that Torn Apart is available at Source Booksellers online and in the store, and at any independent bookstore that may be near you. Thank you so much.
Thank you too. Thanks again, Jelani. Bye-bye.